An introduction to Richard Baxter's The Reformed Pastor, and I'm doing this introduction for pastors. My name is Andy Rowell. This book, The Reformed Pastor by Richard Baxter, was originally published in 1656. There is a longer edition, and you can find that for free. It's in the public domain by William Orma, in which he abridged the original down from a mammoth size and disorganization into something more manageable. And now there are a lot of abridged editions. Here are three that you could consider. One was abridged by James Houston, and it's called Classics of Faith and Devotion. It was originally published in 1982, and it has an introduction from Richard Halverson. And there's another one that has an introduction by J.I. Packer. That one's in the Puritan Paperback series, published by Banner of Truth. And then there is also one, and this one has an audiobook, and it was updated and abridged by Tim Cooper, forward by Chad Van Dixhoorn, and that was published by Crossway in 2021. And there are two different audiobooks, at least. There may be more on Audible. One is the longer version. It's 8 hours long, and it's read very well by Simon Vance. And then there is the more recent one that is only 4 hours long, and that's the Tim Cooper version. So you can know about those. The key idea is the practice of scheduling meetings with everyone who is in your charge. At the time in England, Richard Baxter was responsible for a geographic area, a parish, and he felt responsible for everybody who lived within that area. And this is a really important quote here because it really explains what the practice was that he was urging his fellow pastors to embrace. So I'll read this. We spend Monday and Tuesday from morning almost to night in the work, taking about 15 or 16 families in a week, that we may go through the parish, in which there are upwards of 800 families in a year. All right, so let's stop there. He is then doing, ideally, 8 families, 7 or 8 families per day on Monday and Tuesday. So in an 8-hour day, let's say from 9 to 5, as you'll see, he's dealing with one family every hour approximately. So I'll go on in that quote. He says, and I cannot say that one family has refused to come to me, but few persons excused themselves and shifted it off. So a few people did, put it off or say they couldn't meet with him. And he says, and I find more outward signs of success with most that do come than from all my public preaching to them. If you say, so anyway, he said that of all my public preaching, I'm actually more effective one-on-one or in small groups with them as a family. I feel like I'm having more of an impact. So again, that's his main thing. He's really pushing people to do is not just preach, preachers and pastors, not just to preach, but actually to meet and to have some sort of a system to meet with the people in your congregation. And then he takes up one objection. If you say it is not so in most places, so if you say that's not how it works, people are not used to that, Baxter answers, I wish that the blame of this may not lie much with ourselves. If, however, some refuse your help, that will not excuse you for not affording it to them that would accept of it. If you ask me what course I take for order and expedition, I may have here mentioned that at the delivery of the catechism. So anyway, all he says is it's actually, if it's not happening, we have to look at ourselves as pastors. So yes, I realize it's not happening everywhere. All right. So he says his practice is this: at the delivery of catechisms, or that means teachings, like a question and answer, summary of the faith, Christian education, spiritual formation, discipleship. That's what's happening here. Teaching people, let's say the Ten Commandments, the Apostles' Creed, the Lord's Prayer, those sort of things. But often it was in a question and answer kind of format. So anyway, he says, how do I do it? Again, he's just going to go over what he just said. I take a catalog of all the persons of understanding in the parish. So in other words, he's got a registry, he's got a directory, he's got a phone book or whatever, a list of everybody in the whole, all the farms and all the little people in the village. And the clerk goeth a week before to every family to tell them what day to come and at what hour. One family at 8 o'clock, the next at 9, next at 10 a.m. And I am forced by the number to deal with a whole family at once, but ordinarily I admit not any of another family to be present. In other words, he doesn't, allow the next family who's waiting to go next. It's private. It's just with that family, generally. All right. So that's his practice, is to check in spiritually, quiz people, ask how their faith is with a schedule of people, of families. So every Monday and Tuesday, that's what he does, with some others, with 2 others. All right, so let's see what else he says. Okay, he says this. For one thing, I'll just point out that he gets this from Paul's speech to the Ephesian elders in Acts 20. So he says, we shall now proceed. This is early in his, the Reformed pastor. He says, we shall now proceed to consider the duty which is recommended in the text. He's talking about Acts 20. Take heed to all the flock. It is, he says, you see all the flock or every individual member of our charge. To this end, it is necessary that we should know every person that belongeth to our charge, for how can we take heed to them if we do not know them? And the verse says in the NIV, keep watch over yourselves and all the flock. So anyway, he's really diving into that, and he's going to talk a lot about the integrity of pastors. So keep watch over yourselves. But he says also all the flock, and you've got to know them by name. You've got to go out and actually have contact with them besides just preaching. And then he says right after that, this is he quotes Acts 20:20, which is a little earlier in the passage. Paul taught his hearers not only publicly but from house to house. And this is Paul speaking in Acts 20:20. You know that I have not hesitated to preach anything that would be helpful to you, but I've taught you publicly and from house to house. It's just interesting because what Baxter is saying is he's saying, yes, it's fine to have worship services where you preach from a pulpit, but see also the Apostle Paul saying he preached from house to house. So basically, Baxter is saying we have got to recover this. We have got to have that part of our duty done better. We need to embrace this whole thing of going from house to house. So that's, I think, where he gets this idea from, those phrases right there. And it's a great passage for pastors, this speech by the Apostle Paul. He's going to talk a little bit more about the details here. It's actually a long book, and this is only kind of the other time that he actually talks about his own practice. So I want to read that, and I also want you to notice that he's actually talking about this because he's explaining how he knows it cuts into his sermon prep time. In other words, he's going to say it actually probably does hurt my preaching quality to spend 2 full days doing this catechesis work, this practice of visiting families. Now, in other places, he actually says, no, it really does help me preach better to know the needs of the people. I have a better relationship with them. They're able to hear me probably on, from the pulpit better because they know me. So anyway, but let's see what he says here. I will give you the instance of my own case. So I'll explain my own case. He says, we are together 2 ministers and a third at a chapel. So there's 3 of them, willing to spend every hour of our time in Christ's work. Before we undertook this work, our hands were full, and now we are engaged to set apart 2 days every week from morning to night for private catechizing and instruction, so that any man may see that we must leave undone all that other work that we want to do at that time. And we are necessitated to run upon the public work of preaching with small preparation. So anyway, all right, so he just basically said, this is what we've decided to do. We've decided to put our time on Monday and Tuesday, so we're not getting done, the other things we would have done on those days. And he says he's going to talk about preaching here. So this is a little bit of a tangent, but he's going to basically say it may take away from the sheer amount of hours that we can put into preparing to preach. We are necessitated to run upon the public work of preaching with small preparation, and so must deliver the message of God so rawly and confusedly and unanswerably to its dignity and the needs of men's souls, that it is a great trouble to our minds to consider it, and a greater trouble to us when we are doing it. And yet it must be so. There is no remedy unless we will omit this personal instruction. We must needs run this unpreparedly into the pulpit, and to omit this we dare not. It is so great and necessary work. So he's saying, I had to do it. And I don't know any other way to do it. If we don't do this Monday and Tuesday, which does take away from my sermon prep, I just can't in good conscience not do this very important work. Okay, and he says, and when we have incurred all the aforementioned inconveniences and have set apart 2 whole days a week for this work, it will be as much as we shall be able to do to go over the parish once in a year, being about 800 families, and which is worse than that, we shall be forced to cut it short and to do it less effectually to those that we do it, having above 15 families a week to deal with. All right, so he's saying it takes us a year, being about 800 families. And, even that, the 1 hour goes fast. Like we can't do it justice. I actually need more time to really disciple and catechize these families, but we're kind of pushing them through on a conveyor belt, like a modern day therapist or a doctor's appointment or something where billable hours, I don't know, where they just, you can meet with them, but then when the timer buzzes, then you have to move on to the next people. All right. He says there needs to be more of a personal touch. The workers are few. That's really the idea here. So he says, and alas, how small a matter is it to speak to a man only once in a year, and that so cursily as we must be forced to do in comparison to what their necessities require. So he says, this is just talking to people once a year. I have to be this intentional just to speak in a spiritual conversation, check in with people once a year. All right. Like a physical, a doctor, your annual physical, that's sort of his annual checkup. That's all I have the opportunity to do, even with this really, rigorous schedule on Mondays and Tuesdays. Yet are we in hope of some fruit of this much, but how much more might it be if we could but speak to them once a quarter? So 4 times a year, that'd be way better. And do the work more fully and deliberately, as you that are in smaller parishes may do. So he says, if you don't have as big a church or, as big a population that you have to minister to, you could meet with people 4 times a year instead of just once. And he says, and many ministers in England have 10 times the number of parishioners which I have, so that if they should undertake the work which we have undertaken, they can go over the parish but once in 10 years. So he's saying some parishes have 10 times more, like 8,000, let's say. So he said it would take 10 years for you'd only speak to a person once in 10 years. So that while we are hoping for opportunities to speak to them, what ends up happening, we hear of one dying after another, and to the grief of our souls are forced to go with them to their graves before we could ever speak a word to them personally to prepare them for their change. In other words, I'm doing funerals. That's all the time I have. And he mentions elsewhere that it just makes me feel bad that I didn't get a chance to meet this person, get to know this person, talk to this person. Here I'm doing their funeral, and I don't feel great about that. And so, that's the problem that he's wanting to address. That bothers him. So I thought this was interesting. I didn't know about this in my latest reading of this book. I had noticed that this comes up a few times. He says to get more staff to help you if you can't minister personally to everyone. I just thought that was quite interesting. He says, but some may object. The congregation that I'm set over is so great, so big, there's so many people, that it's impossible for me to get to know them all, much more to take heed to all individually. And then he says, might you not have procured assistance for so great a charge? So, and this is somewhat differently from our day, in that, sometimes there would be a pastor who would get all the money for one church. That's what Richard Baxter is sort of talking about. And they could instead split that income with an assistant. So that's what he's going to say. We don't quite have that. We don't articulate that in the same way usually in churches, but actually practically that is maybe the case, that a pastor at a church today too maybe doesn't take the entire salary for all the salaries that the church can pay for. That's not how they want to run the church. They want to split that up among other staff to kind of work as a team. And so I do think that is somewhat still relevant. All right, so he says, might you not have procured assistance for so great a charge? Have you done all that you could with your friends and neighbors to get maintenance for another to help you? So he says, have you actually raised money maybe for more staff to help you? Have you not as much maintenance yourself as might serve yourself and another? So are you taking the entire salary that the church, like a humongous salary, that actually if you took a little less, there would be room for another staff member, another pastor? What though it will not serve to maintain you in fullness? He says, no, even though you're getting pretty highly paid. He says, is it not more reasonable that you should pinch your flesh and family than undertake a work that you cannot perform and neglect the souls of so many of your flock? So he's saying there are people who I don't want to give half or, a third of my salary to, a youth pastor. I want the whole thing for myself. And he says, wouldn't it be better if you lived on a bit less, and then you could feel good that you were actually doing right by the people you're trying to reach? All right, he says, I know that what I say will seem hard to some, but to me it is an unquestionable thing that if you have but 100 pounds a year, 100, I don't know how much that would be, but that's a lot, I guess, a lot of money. If $100,000 a year. All right. But if you have $100,000 a year, it is your duty to live upon part of it and allow the rest to a competent assistant, rather than that the flock which you are over should be neglected. So it'd be better to share that, to have a children's ministry person, have a youth ministry person, have an associate to share the work with you. If you say, and this is him, Richard, saying, if you say this is That is a hard measure, and that your wife and children cannot so live. I answered, do not many families in your parish live on less? Question mark. All right, so uh, basically he's saying, you'll say, no, no, we need the whole salary. We need the full salary. We can't give a portion of that to an intern, to somebody else. And he says, well, aren't there other people who make it work and who live nearby, your neighbors? So he's trying to have them think about whether they could sacrifice and adjust to actually get this work done of making sure the people who you are responsible for actually are reached. So let me reflect a little bit about what this means today. I think for me, when I was a pastor, uh, I read this and it really jolted me to I was in charge of a bunch of young adults. Let's say I had on my list of people who had occasionally attended some of our young adults 20s, 30s events. I had maybe, let's say, 30 of them on my list, or 40 or 50. I may have even had more than that. So anyway, and I looked through that list and I went through and I like just went through and I emailed a whole bunch of them and just said, hey, I have no issue with you. Just want to get to know you. But could we set up a time for lunch, coffee? There's no problem. I'm not recruiting you for anything. I just really want to get to know you and meet with you. So anyway, this prompted me to send, I don't know, 20 of those out and then sort of schedule and go to people's workplace and meet with them. And it was just a way to get myself out from sending emails, from organizing things, from planning events, to actually having conversations with people and asking them about their lives, about their work, about the things they were going through. And so those were spiritual conversations. So anyway, those were a source eventually of good relationships and leadership development and recruiting people and caring for those people when they had difficulties as well. So anyway, I was very inspired by this, and I think other people are. So I think the we could just call this intentionality, having a strategy. Like, what is your strategy as a pastor, just in general, like preaching, but also getting to know people? And then, like, he's got, this system and schedule too. I just think that's fascinating to see somebody in the 17th century being kind of a go-getter who wants to have habits that get things done. So you see kind of an efficiency here in Richard Baxter. And again, I think what the issue is as Paul says, in Acts 20, I preached and went house to house. Like, we also intend to go to house to house. We intend to meet with people, but sometimes we don't get around to it. And we're just putting out fires. So anyway, meeting with people, that's just really important. Okay, being systematic, prepared ahead of time, scheduling. Why? Because preaching is not enough. People are more moved by personal conversations and guidance and advice. His plan was, ideally he was reaching the head of the family or a neighbor, or someone who could carry on the work of catechizing. We think about homeschooling or family devotions. Hey, if you're meeting with the parents and the family and you're wanting them to have spiritual practices in the home, that's fine. I think today, Baxter didn't have a vision for this. Wesley did later, but like having people in small groups, that was kind of the next iteration, I think, that made a lot of sense, rather than just catechesis and memorizing the catechism. More accountability and discussion with people. All right, but the point is that we even today see that therapy, mentoring, coaching, those are like one-on-one conversations. We see that dialogue really does lead to personal transformation. So we want to have that be a component of our ministry as pastors rather than just being a preacher. The practice does help the preacher to be in touch with people on the ground, to get to know their congregation, to be not just responding to crises, but like, hey, no, I'm meeting with a kind of normal slice of people, a normal selection of people, a kind of representative sample of people. So I'm getting a feel for where people are at in our church or in our community. So I'm not just spending time with the most spiritual people, nor like the really difficult people. So I think that's a good thing about this. Just also, I think it's true that people are wary. That's a thing that he talks about a lot in this book, is that, if people aren't used to it, they will, may not be receptive to it. So you've got to kind of be relational and warm and tactful in how you work with people till people kind of get used to this. Like I said, when I first started doing this, I had some people who, when they got email from the pastor or a call or a text from the pastor, they were like, "What's wrong? What did I do?" They were like nervous, kind of holding their breath the whole coffee, and I didn't have an agenda, and it interfered with the whole conversation because they were still waiting the whole time and nervous about what I was on about, what I was really there about. So I tried to, even in my initial conversation with them or email to them or whatever, to say, hey, can we meet? To just say, there's no issue at all. I just want to meet. So to try to dissipate that concern of theirs. All right. The whole book is something of a harangue, kind of like over and over and over and over. He's talking to pastors and getting them to do this stuff. And I think it's really good because, it's good for pastors to read this because he's right. I mean, he's right on a lot. And so it's good for our souls to see him drawing upon, Bernard of Clairvaux, Gregory of Nazianzus, Augustine, and others, Gregory the Great. And he's drawing on scripture, and he's really on target because he wants pastors to be a moral, good example, following Jesus in everything they do. If they're going to teach something, they should model it. He's got a very high standard, and that's continuing in the kind of some other people I think about as Gregory the Great, Teresa of Avila, George Herbert, also really emphasizing the integrity of the pastor. Just this style is that he imagines their objections, and he forcefully responds to them. He's basically saying, yes, you have the time to do this. Yes, you have the money to do this. Yes is the right thing to do. But I think hopefully, there are things in these either abridged versions or the long version which strike you as kind of a kick in the pants. I don't know, kind of him grabbing you and shaking you and saying, this is what it means to be a pastor, and you need to care for the sheep. And so hopefully that's a positive experience for people who read a Reformed pastor. I think it really usually is, to have somebody like Richard Baxter with this vision of an ideal, conscientious, devoted pastor reminding us of what that looks like. A preacher preaching at the preachers. Just one other kind of point about the context. You see some references, one especially late, where he says that, the Reformation happened, in the decades prior to his ministry, and it was all this kind of bloodshed and wars, and government in England was switching back and forth between Catholic and Protestant kings and queens. And this was, Martin Luther, you know, thought that the Roman Catholic Church needed reformation. And so, there's this massive upheaval, and, people have died, all sorts of things. And we were really worried about the apathy, spiritual apathy, and of the Roman Catholics. That's the Protestant protesting that. And now the Protestants are apathetic. So he's just really wanting to say what's going on with that, and he says, like, hey, Roman Catholics, the papists is what he calls them, they have confession, where a priest, parishioner will go and confess their sins to a priest. And he's like, well, they kind of have that right, that a pastor should have a personal counseling interaction with a parishioner from time to time. He says the papists are kind of right. The Catholics are kind of right about church unity, because that's one of the parts of this book too, is he's saying we as Protestants need to put aside our petty differences and come together. And so he's sort of feeling like, yeah, the Catholics are kind of right to call us schismatic, and that we, can't be unified and stuff. So it's interesting that, he's sort of critiquing the Protestant Reformation, which he's really part of. And so he's saying the pastors and the church really need to be reformed. And that's what the title means, the Reformed Pastor. Like, we thought we were going to be better than the Roman Catholic Church. Well, let's do it. That's sort of the idea of this. He actually doesn't, that I recall, kind of use this word, we need a reformed church. It had a different title, actually, his original title. But he's not coming from, just for clarity's sake, he's not actually coming from like a John Calvin, Calvinist. That's often what we think about when we think about the Reformed Church. We think about the Reformed Church coming out of Holland or something like that, or John Calvin was Geneva, Switzerland. That's actually not really what's going on here. Even Scotland, the Presbyterians in Scotland, there's a little bit of interaction with the Presbyterians that he mentions here in the book. But when he says reformed, that's not really what he's meaning, that like we need to get back to God's sovereignty, rather than, free will and, some of those tulip, total depravity and those kind of emphases. That's not what he's talking about when he's talking about the Reformed pastor. He's talking about we need pastors who are the good kind, who make the person who is the priest who is, selling indulgences, or, that kind of stereotypical bad priest who is just in it for a kind of a superstitious way, kind of the way, that's sort of how Luther couched the Reformation. We actually need to be the good pastor. We need to be good pastors. All right, just a little bit of strengths and critique of the Reformed pastor. As I've tried to say here, I think it's inspiring to be relational. I think he's right that preaching is not enough. I think he's right about the integrity of the pastor. I mean, and those are just really, really rich things to be inspired by and have wash over you as you read or listen to this book. Critique, I think he's sort of more grumpy than, let's say, I think even Gregory the Great, but for sure Teresa of Avila, who's a hoot and funny, and George Herbert, who's not that much earlier, but a bit earlier in the century. George Herbert is poetry, and he's quite relational. He's quite self-deprecating. So in comparison, Richard Baxter is kind of relentlessly preachy and serious. So, and I really saw that in the second thing, fear-based catechism, right at the end of the long version of this book. He talks about what he does in, meeting with people, and it's some of that is really just like fear-based kind of stuff of just like, what would happen if you died today. So anyway, I just don't feel like that's the strongest kind of way to work with people. So anyway, I just think that comes through, that he's strong at preaching and leadership, and but I think like his actually relational skills himself, they don't strike me as quite as strong as Teresa, as George Herbert, even Gregory the Great. All right. And then clergy centric. I mean, that's the other thing here, that he really does have an idea of like, hey, there should be, I mean, for him, he's making this pretty profound move for his time to say, like, why don't we have not just one parish pastor or priest, let's have like a whole bunch of them, and let's share that salary with a bunch of staff. So that's great. But the next stage, like I said, is that John Wesley will say, we actually just need people to be in groups, accountability groups, small groups outside of Sunday morning, where they're keeping each other accountable, asking about each other's weeks. So that democratizes it, the kind of pastoral role. Like, in other words, let's have people be friends and care for each other, and let's remind each other of all those one another verses from the New Testament, and those sort of communal things, rather than really this rigid view, which Richard Baxter hardly at all gets away from at all. It's just, he's really got in his mind that the clergy member has to do all of this, and that limits him. It limits the math when he's got to do it all, rather than trying to equip people, and then have people meet in smaller groups with lay people, really. All right. One kind of final example, which was new to me, I hadn't noticed before, maybe in the abridged versions that I saw in reading the full version here, which I thought was just interesting because it struck me as kind of relevant to today, and just an interesting example of what happens when you read somebody from the 17th century. He says, exercise enough to be functional, but not to be in perfect health. It's just sort of an interesting thing. Like, he's almost like, I mean, it reminds me of the, physical exercise of some benefit, but godly exercise is, worth much more. And that verse, and he says this, he says, we may take time for necessary recreation and yet attend to this work. So he says an hour or half an hour's walk before meat. So I think he means before dinner. If you take an hour or a half hour's walk sometime, he says that's as much recreation as is necessary for the health of most of the weaker sorts of students. So he's actually, that's sort of what he's just going to say. I mean, he just thinks, an hour, half hour walk's really good for you, which I thought is actually right in a lot of ways. That's like a really standard thing that people talk about zone 1 and zone 2, exercise and that kind of stuff, like heart rate, your heart rate not going up super high, but just like walking, and that's really good for you. So I thought that was kind of interesting that he had come across that himself, that's what works. And he says this, he says, I have reason to know somewhat of this by long experience. So he's a walker, apparently. He says, though I have a body that hath languished under great weaknesses for many years, and my diseases have been such as to require as much exercise as almost any in the world, and I have found exercise the principal means of my preservation till now, and therefore have as great reason to plead for it as any man that I know. Yet I have found that the foresaid proportion hath been blessed to my preservation. though I know that much more had been like to have tended to my greater health. So what he's saying is he's saying, I'm totally sickly. I'm prone to sickness. I've been really sick with all kinds of stuff. And he said, actually, more exercise would have helped me to become stronger. That would have been better for me to even exercise more. But I found that half hour, an hour walk before dinner, that kind of keeps me going. That's preserved me. So he says, I think that's kind of enough. So I don't know that you need to spend a huge amount of time on recreation and exercise. So anyway, it's just sort of interesting because these are conundrums that we think about today. Um, he says, indeed, I do not know one minister in 100 that needeth so much exercise as myself. So I was just prone to weakness. I really did need exercise. He says, me more than probably anybody else. He says, yea, I know abundance of ministers that scarce ever use any exercise at all, though I commend them not in this. So he says, actually, there's a bunch of people who don't exercise at all. A lot of pastors, and he says that's not good. But I'm just saying, he's treating somebody who's saying, I don't have time to do this catechesis work to meet with people because I got to exercise. And he's like, all right, exercise half an hour of walking, while you're doing the catechesis. And he said, some people don't even do that much. And I've found that that's kind of enough. That'll get you through. All right, he says, I doubt not, but it is our duty to use so much exercise as is necessary for the preservation of our health, so far as our work requireth. Otherwise, we should, for one day's work, lose the opportunity of many. So he says, we should use as much exercise as necessary for the preservation of our health. So yes, you have to do enough. You have to take care of your body enough to keep going. Otherwise, um, but so anyway, so far as our work requires. So he says that we definitely need to take care of ourselves as much as we're required, so we can do the bodily functions of our job. But he says that if we spend a huge amount of time exercising, recreating, or whatever, he says, we will, lose the opportunity of many. Yeah, okay. Yeah, we should, for one day's work, lose the opportunity. So he says, you do need to regularly exercise, otherwise you'll die early or something like that. So that's what that clause means. It's actually a pro-exercise one. We should, for one day's work, lose the opportunity of many. Otherwise, anyway, so in other words, you do need to exercise in order to have a longer life. But this may be done, and yet the work that we are engaged in be done too. So again, he says a little bit of that exercise can be done while you're still doing the catechesis. So anyway, I just thought it was interesting that I thought this advice was not bad from a kind of health perspective, and I thought it's something that is relevant to today. So that's one of the interesting things about all these abridgments is that like sometimes they take out things that seem irrelevant, and then in the end they turn out being relevant. So it's just kind of interesting how history works that way. The kind of details may speak to us. All right, let me just conclude by just talking about the Reformed Pastor. I think it's a really rich, classic book for pastors. And I think it's encouraging. I think it's inspiring. I think it will get you out of the house. It will get you doing stuff, out of the office, meeting with people, having a schedule, being intentional. All that is great. And I think the kind of little downsides of him being sort of grumpy and it being really clergy focused and it all rests on the clergy member. I think probably you'll be able to make the next step beyond that and say, maybe I can equip lay people. Maybe I can produce products, videos or or they can read books or something, so that it's not all on me. But I do really appreciate the admonition from Richard Baxter to read Acts 20, what Paul says to the Ephesian elders, and to take seriously our responsibility as a shepherd. That's what that word means. It's not otherwise in the Bible. The word pastor basically just means shepherd. So anyway, to truly shepherd our flock, and that preaching is not enough. We actually do need to be intentional, even if we are kind of introverted. We need to find ways that make sense to us, that we can have conversations with people, that we can say, how are you doing? Tell me about your work. Tell me about the issues you're thinking about, the issues you're struggling with. Try to elicit that from people so that we can then have rich conversations with them. All right, that's Richard Baxter's The Reformed Pastor.